It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome, listeners, to the Two Jacks, where we go and look in all matters politics and media in Australia and then go around the world and check out what's going on there. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack, all the way in Hong Kong, as you'd expect. How are you today, mate?
Good, mate. I'm having a better week than Russell Brand.
Well, yes, we all are. Let's face it. We all are doing a little bit better than Russell Brand. Well, we aren't really going to discuss that. I think this is an issue to handle next week because I think there's going to be a lot more to come out. This is the subject of a 5-year investigation by the Times, the Sunday Times and Channel 4. So I guarantee you an investigation of that length, there will be more. And, of course, there will be more people coming forward as well.
And the amusing thing is that he is a chap who has gone from being a darling of The Guardian and of the left to now being a darling of the quite crazy right.
Crazy fringe right. He really did.
So that makes it amusing in a sense.
Well, yeah, he did make that. I mean, it's hard to know just what his intentions were. It was during the pandemic that he sort of leapt to the fringe. You might remember he was running a concert during the time where vaccine passports were a thing in the UK. And of course, people attending that concert were required to show proof of vaccination, and he tried to wave that away. I'm not sure how he went against sort of government edicts at the time. Of course, this was the same time when Boris was having birthday parties and what have you in number 10. But we'll have a look at the Brand allegations next week because there will be more. That is an unfolding story as we speak. But Jack, what's going on in Hong Kong today?
Well, the manufacturers are busily knocking out mooncakes.
Mooncakes. Now, you're you despise a mooncake, don't you? You're not a fan.
Let me describe a mooncake to you. It's a little round thing. It's made of pastry, this sort of very chewy pastry, a bit like what you get on an English pork pie, but far less appetizing.
Ooh,
and then it's filled with what's generally a sweet paste, like a cloyingly sweet paste, sometimes with a century egg stuck in the middle of it. And you're meant to exchange these things at Autumn Festival, which is coming up in a week or so. And you make a big thing of handing them over and all that sort of stuff.
Do you do that? And you hand them out?
I did when I first arrived in Hong Kong, because I'd read the books on how to fit in the new city, all that sort of stuff, and I bought some for the Chinese lady who we were in a service department. She used to sort of daily help, if you like, right. Daily helper. And I bought some for her and handed them over. Now, and they're varying in price. Some of them are really quite expensive. And I handed them over to her, and she kind of looked askance at them. I says, "Oh, you don't like them?" She says, "No." She says, "No, don't eat, but is okay. I will give to relatives I don't like."
So that was your one and only entry into the mooncake giving business.
That was an excellent lesson in how Hong Kong works and of the bluntness of Hong Kongers. And when I started to fall in love with the city, but really I reckon I could get away with producing a third as many mooncakes as they do because people just pass them round. People get them and say, "Oh, thank you very much," and then give them to somebody else.
They sit in the fridge for a while. If you're the end user, they might sit in the fridge for a while. So they must be large if they can hold an egg. They must be. Yeah,
they're a sort of a larger version of an English pork pie. Not that much bigger.
Like a Scotch egg, but sweet. Is that? Am I sort of getting close to it?
Yeah. Well, they haven't always got an egg in them, but they're always sweet. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, enjoy that.
They are not good tucker, mate. They are not.
All right. Well, happy Autumn Festival to you. And I'm assuming that will come with a poultice of public holidays.
Yeah, I think we did get a public holiday. Yes, yeah.
And there'll be more coming as the Autumn Festival kicks in.
Yeah, well, we've got two public holidays coming up. This one might be on a Saturday. That we still have public holidays on Saturdays, but we have National Day. Coming up on the grand final weekend. So,
there you go. Well, that is timely, and we'll get to all of that, all of the sports, particularly the three of the four major footy codes reaching their zeniths. Australia may not be there; the Wallabies may not be there to enjoy the fruits of the World Cup by the looks of things. But we'll get to all that in sport because, as discussed last week, Jack, we wanted to talk about the new Industrial Relations Act and what it means. And you've been taking a look at it, Jack.
I have.
It's not through the Parliament yet, of course, but it's gone through the House, I believe, hasn't it? Yeah.
It has. Yeah.
So, yet to get through the Senate. And all we've sort of heard so far, all I've really heard so far, is a fair amount of bleating from employers' groups.
Yeah, and it's as always with these industrial relations changes, it's hard to know exactly how they're going to work out until you start
Till the rubber hits the road.
Operating on the ground. Because,
great policy cliche.
Yeah, because the sometimes a government thinks they know how it's going to work, but that depends upon how the employers and the unions interpret it and how they react to it. Sometimes employers will just go along with things. Sometimes they'll fight them, and vice versa. So you really don't know how it's going to work until it comes to fruition.
They seem fairly upset at the moment, Jack.
They do. It varies a bit. I did a bit of a deep dive on not just on what the industry associations were saying about it, but what the lawyers, industrial relations lawyers who generally act for employers, what they were saying about it. And the lawyers were saying, well, look, we're going to have to change a few things, but it's not too bad.
So what does, here we've got a director of mediation company called CoSolve and a former deputy president of the Fair Work Commission, Anna Booth, who says most experts are probably not across every fine detail of the legislation. You sort of alluded to that ourselves. And she went on to say, as far as I'm aware, there's no consolidated legislation available yet. I'm not quite sure what she means by that. I mean, the black letter stuff's out there, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's that. They hadn't. I think when she wrote that, they hadn't actually consolidated. They hadn't done the physical act of consolidating the act. Anna Booth, by the way, was used to be the federal secretary of the clothing union.
Ah, okay.
I knew her knew her slightly back when, in my Slater and Gordon days. Julia Gillard was our industrial relations head then, and she was good pals with Anna Booth, and they fought some good fights together.
So am I right in thinking that Anna Booth would have been a Gillard appointment to the FWC?
Quite possibly, yes.
I would think that's a very likely scenario.
I hope you're not implying anything, any favouritism or impropriety.
The coalition just loaded up the Fair Work Commission in the last few weeks of its government, and the Administrative Affairs Tribunal and a whole bunch of other things. But look, getting back to industrial relations, what does it mean for enterprise bargaining? Does it broaden it? Does it allow multi-employer bargaining?
Yeah, it does both of those things.
Yes.
But exactly how that's going to work, we really don't know. So it does that. It allows employees to choose multi-enterprise bargaining. It doesn't. I don't think we're going to go back to the old. You remember you're not quite as old as me, but nearly. And our younger listeners won't understand this, but just how important the trade unions were in Australian society. That every media organisation had at least one dedicated industrial relations reporter. They used to hang around the Trades Hall Council in Lygon Street all the time. And everybody knew the names of the major union leaders. Everybody in the country knew the names of the major union leaders. Almost no one does now. That's an extraordinary change over 25 years.
Well, the unionisation of the workforce has declined to around about 12 to 15%, depending on whose figures you look at.
And most of those in the public sector.
Yeah, that's right.
In two sectors, public sector and construction.
Look, here we've got some got a quote from a fellow by the name of Ferguson. I believe he's linked to the Australian Industry Group. And he says the most controversial reform is the shake-up of rules relating to collective bargaining. There will also be scope for unions to obtain orders from the FWC extending the coverage of such agreements, EBAs, to employers that had not been a party to negotiating them, even if the employer opposes it. So that's basically imposing an EBA on a group that doesn't have an EBA in place, Jack. Am I right?
Yeah, and imposing it on employers and employees who don't necessarily want it.
And where is this likely to strike hardest?
That's kind of hard to know. Well, that and the new boot operations, which is the better off overall test.
Yes.
Those two aspects are really hard to know in advance just how they're going to work.
So the better off overall test. This was the boot. Correct me if I'm wrong. That was a Howard government. What shall we say? Not a body, but a policy, I suppose, or a policy acronym. Is that correct? The better off overall test?
That's my recollection. It dates to that time at any event.
During when they tried to bring in work, what was it called? Work. They got absolutely smashed over it.
Work safe or work fair. I can't remember which
work
was
fair. The work fair reforms, which were decidedly pro-employer. But so we have the better off overall test. And this, quoting Ferguson again, says the FWC will obtain new powers to amend a proposed agreement to address any concern over whether it passes the boot. In short, Ferguson says the FWC will be able to change or rewrite terms of an agreement that is lodged with it, even if the employer doesn't agree to the alteration. Now I'm starting to see how the employers might get might be a little bit irksome over this, Jack.
Yeah, well, again, what you note there is that the Fair Work Commission will be able to do this, and what we really don't know is how much they'll do it, how often, and in what circumstances. And you know, the history of industrial relations tells us to just sit back and be a little bit cautious to see how it happens.
There are some other things in here, Jack, and I just want to talk about pay secrecy. Isn't it your business? Isn't it your business between your employer and yourself as to how much money you earn?
And that's been sort of it's a sort of a standard term in most employment contracts that you shouldn't disclose it to other people, including workmates. The unions don't like that because they want to be able to. What they would like is to go back to the old days where everyone got paid the same. But I think that horse has kind of bolted.
Yeah, over time, these changes may serve to shift the current cultural tendency of employees in Australia to not discuss their remuneration with colleagues. And so there'll be a new opening up. People will say, "G'day, my name's Jack and I earn $48,000 a year. I'm contracted to earn that sort of money." And that is designed, I suppose, that the design elements are to reduce discrimination based on gender and opportunity, let's say.
Yeah, I suspect that's the motivation behind it. I just don't think a lot of people are going to want that to happen to. A lot of employees are going to want that to happen to them.
Right, yeah, no, indeed. And there are included in the legislation further protections on sexual harassment, Jack, in the workplace.
Yeah, there have been. And the sort of a hot ticket issue, I think, is what they're going to do about flexible work hours and what they're going to do. This is not currently before the House, I don't believe, what they're going to do about gig workers.
Yes, and that seems to be a focus, certainly from Tony Burke's comments, who's the relevant minister, industrial relations minister. Is that people working in the gig economy, our much beloved delivery drivers, the people who kept us fed and clothed during the pandemic, Uber drivers, those sorts of people, the people who are sort of listed as independent contractors and earn a quid that way, with basically the employer imposing the rates of pay upon them.
Yeah, well, subject to negotiation, but yeah, generally the big dog gets to decide that. This also applies in the construction industry. There's an awful lot of independent contractors who would have been employees 30, 40 years ago, but are now very happy to be independent contractors. And I suspect a lot of the gig workers also are very happy to be independent contractors. So I don't think that genie can be put back in the bottle either.
Yeah, it would seem very difficult to do, but at the same time, you would say that some particularly those working in that sort of food delivery business, we hear some sort of fairly consistent horror stories about their hourly rates of pay and working conditions generally.
Yeah, a similar attempt was made in California to regulate freelance work, so including writers and cartoonists and all sorts of people like that, and it kind of made them unemployable within California. So by and large, they upped sticks and left because they rather enjoy being freelancers, and they understood that without the freedom to freelance, they wouldn't have a job, wouldn't have an income either.
So when do we get to test? Well, obviously this legislation not through the Parliament yet, so it's not been enacted, and it really sits in the ether in terms of the industrial relations landscape at the moment. But when do we see some form of benefit or indeed failure, Jack? Is it years? Is it 2, 3, or is it something we might see immediately?
A couple of years, I would think.
All right.
In terms of just how cautious people are about it, I saw this from, I think it might be Russell Kennedy and Cook, an employers' industrial relations union, and they had, this is what for their clients, if your employment template agreements contain pay secrecy, get rid of them. If your business use fixed term or maximum term contracts, you consider whether these contracts are necessary, and think about changing those. Make sure you're on top of all of the sexual harassment processes. You got that working right. So not huge changes. They were telling their clients, make these minor adjustments, and then we'll see how it goes.
Right. So we're not talking about sweeping reforms, are we? Perhaps something.
Well, they could be, but we don't really know.
Right. Okay. Well, that's as clear as mud, mate. Thanks very much for that. But what you're basically saying is, if it gets through the Senate, and it looks like it will, then we'll get back to it in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, sort of. I see how it works. But a lot of these things. The employees and employers have kind of moved on, and they quite like the new arrangements. And I don't think, as I said, I don't think those genies are going to be able to put back in the bottle.
The ACTU and unions generally would be happy with these reforms?
Yeah. They want to be dealt back to the table.
It deals them back in, doesn't it?
Yeah. And they want to be important again, as everyone does.
Well, everyone likes to feel important, Jack. Are we? All right. Well, there's a take on it. You'll see it in 2 years, but no real need for panic. I did see some rather amusing shrieking from employers' groups. And, of course, there was a wonderful thing in the Fin Review, Jack. I don't know if you saw the video. Billionaire, I can't think of his name right now, and that's probably a bit of a disgrace on my part, talking about basically how employees should be on their bloody hands and knees thanking their employers for just giving them a gig. I don't know if you saw that, but it caused a great deal of consternation.
The amusing thing is he was masquerading as a small businessman, but
there's a fair bit of that going on too.
Yes, but what the story I think hadn't disclosed was that the reason he was a small businessman is that he had built a large business and had sold it very advantageously.
For a large amount of money. I mean, an extraordinarily large amount of money.
Yes.
So look, I think it's probably wise for us not to look too much at employer groups or indeed trade unions. when we look at some sort of analysis of industrial relations, because it's just whatever we get from those two groups is going to be basically, I don't like change. Well, no, it's going to be we are sort of, some of the employers are going to say we're resistant to change and we don't like it, and the trade union saying, well, we want to be dealt it back into the table.
Yeah, they're always talking their own book.
That's right, exactly.
And I can tell you from some considerable experience, as organisations, they're a bit like impressionist paintings. They look a lot better provided you stand back and don't get too close.
Very nice, Jack. All right, moving on to The Voice. We did have some really substantial rallies on the weekend, big group in Melbourne in particular, but meetings, rallies throughout the major cities and the regions of Australia. Jack, some big numbers there, but even if you get 100,000 on the streets, it's still, when you look at the totality of the Australian voting public, it's still pretty small numbers. And there doesn't seem to be, I haven't looked at any polling over the last week, but it doesn't seem to be any great shift in sentiment yet. This is where the Yes campaign thinks that they can push those soft no's and the don't no's into the Yes camp. So far, not so good. But there was a bit of discomfort in the no base when Warren Mundine was interviewed on The Insiders on Sunday, and he talked about treaties and he talked about, yes, he supported the change of date on Australia Day, and you could hear heads hitting tables, Jack.
You could.
Across the country.
As you could when Jacinta Price was talking at the press club earlier in the week. And I think I might be doing a disservice here, but she said that she didn't think the Indigenous people had been or at least we're still suffering any harm from British
disadvantaged. I think that was the question.
Disadvantaged, yes.
Yeah, and it was a question put to her at the National Press Club last week.
Both of them look to me like they're enjoying a bit of success, and there's a little bit of hubris set in.
It looked very much like that to me. When the question was put to Jacinta, Senator Price, I should say, she paused for a moment, and it was almost like, I'm going to answer this. No, I'm going to go with the flow here. And then off she rolled. And look, I mean, it is identifiably wrong, the argument there. We can talk about knocking the life expectancies off Indigenous Australians by 20 years since colonialism. That alone would amount to a fair amount of disadvantage. What I liked about Warren Mundine's answers to the Insiders is she was being honest. And I've mentioned this before. I know Warren quite well, and he's always been an honest fellow. And I suspect there is some discomfort about some of the No campaign that falls upon him. And I think he was just replying honestly. And that leads to a certain truth that regardless of the outcome, not regardless of the outcome, if the no proposition gets up, as the polling sort of indicates it will, there will be no black hole on reconciliation. It must move forward. And just the question of how is something that really needs to be addressed, particularly by the No camp. I mean, I know they can just say no, vote no. If you don't understand it, vote no, all that sort of stuff. And it's not for them to propose what must happen beyond the referendum date. But at least Warren had the honesty to deal with it, because reconciliation cannot die if the referendum does.
Nor do I think it will. There is, in my view, no shortage of goodwill in the community to fix some of the problems, as many as that can be fixed. The only reason the referendum will fail, as I think it will, is the particular proposal they came up with.
Yeah, And that includes treaties, because the states are negotiating treaties right
Yes,
now.
of course they are. And generally they go okay, but some of them are going to work and some of them are not.
Yeah, I think Western Australia's had a treaty in place in the southwest of the state for a long period of time. It's not negotiating treaties at the moment, but it has had what we would call a treaty in place for with the Noongar people for a very, very long time. And the sky didn't fall in, and no one lost their backyards and all this sort of stuff.
And then it tried another one more recently, and it all fell over.
Where they really fell apart, where Western Australia, and really Western Australia, sort of a year and a half ago, Western Australians were profound supporters of the voice referendum as they understood it at the time. But then particularly farming groups and mining companies to a lesser degree were sort of had this rather onerous legislation put upon them about sacred sites, and really it had shifted the balance towards, let's say, farmers to identify and then have assessed sacred sites that they probably don't know too much about. It was incredibly confusing and pretty much the wrong way to go.
So bad it had to be dumped by a Labor government unceremoniously. It was, put in the rubbish bin, and the rubbish bin was taped down so no one ever knew it existed.
It had to be actually taken down with a great deal of fanfare because they needed to take that heat out of the electorate.
Yeah, but look, a year ago, 60+% of people were in favour of the voice. And what's happened since then, as they've found out what's in the proposal, they've steadily dropped away. And it's as simple as that. It was the wrong proposal.
I did see a political marketer on the 7:30 show last night, and I can't think of his name, but he's been around for a long time. And he was saying, and I think this is pretty much what you've been saying, Jack, that that the government had basically presented this to the Australian people as a sales exercise rather than a discussion point. Now, we understand that Albo made a commitment to Gulawai Yuendamu Gulawai Yunupingu, and he wouldn't back away from that. But that might be the problem. Not his commitment, but the fact that this was presented to the Australian people rather than saying to the Australian people, here's what we've got, let's work this through, let's see if we can't pull you along with us.
Yeah. People liked the tin. Unfortunately, when they had a look at what was in the tin, they didn't like that.
Yeah, well, we haven't got a vote cast yet, of course. I did notice in yesterday's Australian that Tony Abbott was exultant about conservatism in Australia. And I thought, might be just a little bit early there, Tony.
Yeah.
You have made a couple of slip-ups along these lines in the past, and doing a lap of honour before a vote has been cast in the referendum might just be a little bit of hubris and a little bit premature.
There was briefly on.
Did you read it, by the way?
I did. I did read it.
Gee whiz. Wasn't it a pile of steaming crap from a bloke who's been cast out by his own electorate?
There used to be a television program on horse racing in Victoria. Hamish McLaughlin and my old pal Ross Patterson Campbell, or Ross Stevenson as he's known, and they used to have a segment called "Going the Early Crow."
Yes, that's what it was. Yeah, it was just a little bit early.
Yeah.
But Jack, is the polling wrong?
Well, this has been a lot of fun on Twitter.
It has been, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So we had some really big crowds. I mean, I don't know. I didn't see too many crowd estimates, and they're always a bit murky anyway. But there was what seemed to be a pretty large crowd in Melbourne, and people were saying, po-faced, they were saying, well, you've got all these people on the streets, so there must be. The polls, therefore, must be wrong. And that was exactly what Cookers was saying back in the pandemic with their freedom marches with, exaggerated crowds. It might have been 8,000. They called them 800. And then saying, look, we represent the majority of Australians. So it was the same mindset.
Yeah, so they were going completely nuts on Twitter. And Cos Samaras, who I think is a director of Redbridge, the polling company.
Yeah, he's a Redbridge.
But he's
former Labor bloke, by the way.
Yeah, he's a Labor bloke through and through. And they were having a real crack at him because he said, well, the polling's the polling, and people are coming up with all sorts of weird and wonderful explanations as to why the polling might be wrong. And in the end, poor Mr. Samaras had enough.
He did. He had a gutful.
He said, I wonder, is this the same view people had on Newspile when it predicted a Labor landslide in Victoria, a slight majority for Labor in Canberra, or a difficult win in New South Wales for Labor? And for what it's worth, if any suffering from this level of polling denialism walked into my Labor campaign office when I worked for that party and espoused those views, I would have kicked them out. You are not a progressive if you reject science and maths.
Yeah.
Poor Cos had well and truly enough.
Yeah, because well, look, I mean, polling is polling, and we know that polling can be wrong, but we generally see, and Cos was out there to point out various things where they got it right. And I think one of the issues was 2019. Where Bill Shorten and Labor were heavily backed in to win and of course lost, I think 51.5 to 48.5. And
the polling was wrong within the margin of error in that.
It was wrong within the margin of error, and that's the margins of error on, let's say, 1,500 people or poll respondents is generally sits around about 3%, depending on methodology. So it's always, you've always got that. I mean, when we look at...
And Cos is saying that the polling and the voice is so far beyond the margin of error as not to matter.
When we look at the yes case, I think the best case scenario for them is to, when they're ahead in Tasmania, only by a little bit, they've fallen behind in Victoria, and they've fallen behind pretty substantially in New South Wales. If they were able to pick up those three, but they would need to win them 54-46 across the board. Tasmania's numbers don't count so much. And then they would need to pick up South Australia by somewhere around that margin, and that's their pathway to victory. That's we're excluding Queensland and WA. This seems lost. It just seems lost.
Queensland and West Australia are gone, and South Australia's not looking good. Yeah. So as you say, to get the majority overall, they're going to need, and a majority of states, they're going to need about 54% of the vote plus. I mean, they're a long way shy of that.
Seem a long way shy of that. Not a vote yet cast, so we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, and we apologise to Cos Samaras if we've sort of traduced his polling along the way. But the polling doesn't look good at all. And I was talking to a couple of people who aren't necessarily political, and how they viewed the referendum. And they were talking about it being divisive, that this was not a unifying thing for the Australians. That's their views, and they're entitled to them. I would disagree, and I did disagree with the fellows that I spoke to, but that was their view. And it's not a racist view. I think that's one of the great mistakes that the Yes campaign has made, depending on how you interpret some of the comments. But the idea, even the very idea of saying, look, those people who support the no proposition, even if it's that sort of 20% that Marcia Langton identified as rusted on, you can't really go around calling them racist, and you can't, because you will actually harden hearts and basically end up losing. So I think what we have at the moment, Jack, is the yes and no camps who are actually pushing people away at the moment, regardless of outcome, neither of the two parties, yes or no, have covered themselves in glory yet, Jack.
Yeah, this is not being won or lost by the campaigns. This is being lost, I think, because the people have had a look inside the tin and don't like what they see. We're recording this on Tuesday.
Tuesday, the 19th of September, yes.
This morning, there was a demonstration in Adelaide.
Oh, that was last night, yeah. There was a campaign meet last night. That was essentially to get volunteers for the no campaign to hand out on polling day and do a bit of work for them through the campaign.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It was last night. This morning, the Premier, what's his name, Peter Malinauskas, who seems to be a pretty good operator.
Yeah, smart operator, Malinauskas.
He was out giving the Yes campaigners a real kicking for walking along beside this meeting and all that sort of stuff and screaming out and calling people racist, etc., etc.
It's not a good look.
This is no way to behave.
Good look. It's no way to go about it. I did see Chris Minns too speak at the Sydney rally, and he said, "We're not going to denounce the no people. We're not going to traduce them. We're not going to abuse them. We're going to try and convince them." And that's the right approach. That's the right language.
If you want an excellent example of how it should have been gone about, there's on YouTube. There's a video of Jason Clare, very good operator, MP out in Western Sydney. He struck exactly the right tone.
I
still don't think that would have worked because people are always going to have a peek inside the tin and have a look what was there. And once they did that, it wasn't going to succeed.
Oh, you'll be singing along to the Paul Kelly song soon enough, Jack. You just keep listening to it, just on rotation. Just listen to it. All right.
Is that Paul Kelly, the half-forward flanker from
not the Sydney Swans footballer, Brownlow medalist.
He's not the journalist from the Australian?
Different again. There are a number of Paul Kellys around, funnily enough, with Australia's massive Irish population, Irish heritage. Joe Aston, Jack, he must be flying Virgin Blue by now, wouldn't he?
Oh, look,
I don't think he'd get on a Qantas flight.
I tell you what, I think Qantas are going to regret
he would be sitting in the centre seat,
him off a plane.
Aisle 30, basically, right down the back.
Yeah,
with the smell of avgas in his nostrils. But he's had a decent go, and I think he makes some pretty good points, doesn't he? He has been on at Qantas under Joyce, and now without Joyce, he's still going hard.
Yes, he has, and he's got a decent turn of phrase, Joe.
He does. He writes rather wonderfully.
Can I just quote this?
Overly acerbic at times, but not on this occasion.
Yeah. When Qantas had its arse surgically removed and handed to it by the High Court of Australia on Wednesday, the company didn't lodge a statement with the Australian Securities Exchange. Qantas put out a press release like it was upgrading the Qantas Club in Hobart or unveiling a new line of flammable socks in business class.
Oh, most amusing. But there is a statutory requirement on Qantas as a publicly listed company to do more than that. And this was Joe Aston's point, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
That you have to notify the market when good and bad things happen.
And especially a bad thing that might cost you $200 million or plus.
So Joe goes on to say that actually nothing happened. He said there is something seriously wrong with a country where breaking the law and being punished for it is still cheaper than doing the right thing. Hard to disagree.
Hard to disagree at all.
Yeah, so potential...
And then he makes a very good point is they say we had made a provision for this in our forward estimates, right?
Yeah.
And he says, well, how much did you make a provision for? What it's officially costing you now, or how much it's going to cost you after the ACCC have finished with you?
And absolutely right. And that is market-sensitive information, right?
Yep.
So that is something that needs to go through. I mean, you can't just issue a press release. That is completely wrong. You actually have to issue a notice to the Australian Stock Exchange. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yes.
And Qantas,
there's arguments about exactly what triggers that, but I would have thought this is one of those things.
Yeah, potential $200 million bottom line loss, even if they've made contingencies, I doubt that it'll be $200 million worth. And in fact, that is, again, market-sensitive information, and it should have been released to the Australian Stock Exchange and made public, Jack.
Yes.
Still problems there. And of course, there are continued calls, not just from Joe Aston, but others, for the board to resign and the chairperson to resign.
I saw a headline this morning. Richard Goyder, I think, is going before the Senate committee, and suggesting if he didn't get it right this time, he's probably for the chop.
It depends who's on that committee, I suspect. But look, if Ralphie Babbitt or Pauline Hanson are on it, it's bound to be amusing, if nothing else.
I just hope that Labor bloke's found a seat. He's headed off to David Jones and put one off the rack. What's his name? Tony Sheldon.
Tony Sheldon, can you put a tie on, man?
Yeah. I think we should start a GoFundMe, a suit for Tony Sheldon.
Just, you're a senator. Behave yourself. Conduct yourself in an appropriate manner, Tony.
Well, of course, could be worse in the US Senate. They've just changed the dress rules in the US Senate to accommodate Senator Fetterman, the chap who had the stroke. He seems to like wearing a pair of baggy shorts and a hoodie into the Senate.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Senator Schumer has instructed the officials there that that's okay. So Tony Sheldon is doing better than that, but not much.
He's not. He hasn't got the shorts on. The shorts and the hoodie on yet.
Yeah.
But look, it's only a matter of time. The way I see it, Jack. Until Tony just turns up in a T-shirt and a pair of thongs, Jack.
Yeah. Well, if you're going to do that, Tony, become a podcaster. We can wear what we like.
Yeah, that's right. I am wearing shorts and thongs today, Jack. It's
I'm
33 degrees, or will be 33 degrees in the Southern Highlands today. Look, it's a magnificent spring, but we are all sort of in the back of our minds going, "Ooh, this is going to get a bit warm this summer." Very early for Sydney to be in the mid-30s. And we're getting a bit of that today. Lovely weather, by the way. Nothing to complain about there. But what's it going to be like when we hit, December, January, February, March? All right, we're going to move over to the United States, Jack, and we're looking at things that are very, very political here. Look, I did notice, and it's not in my notes, but the Union of Automobile Workers is basically on strike in 3 locations. And I just want to let you know that Trump is actually turning up in Michigan to speak with the striking workers, and the striking workers, it must be said, aren't terribly happy about seeing him. So that's one thing. But we're looking at a little bit of polling today, among other issues, and Trump has a solid lead in the battleground states. And Trump has a solid lead in the battleground states, crucial to determining the outcome of the 2020 election, according to the Reuters Ipsos poll, which is a fairly high. It's not top of the range, but it is a fairly highly regarded poll. Trump leads by 6 points in Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, and Michigan. And of course, there's the caveat that we are 13 months away from the presidential election, and a long way to go, and a lot can happen.
It certainly can, but that sort of lead would give him an electoral college victory of give him 312 electoral college votes to 226. So it would be a bigger win than he had over Hillary Clinton. So that's if the poll was held this weekend. Yeah,
that's right. So lots going to happen. We'll look at some polling. There's actually some interesting stuff, but it would seem that the NYT, the New York Times, and WAPO are both running heavily with can Joe Biden please resign or not run?
Yeah,
because they think that he's doomed. And WAPO has gone even harder again today, Jack.
Yes. Yeah, saw it earlier this morning.
Well, just quote from one piece, and this is an opinion piece, but it says Biden would carry 2 big liabilities into a 2024 campaign. He would be 82 when he began a second term. I think that would make him the oldest president to be in the White House at 82, and it goes back a fair way. According to a recent Associated Press NORC poll, 77% of the public, including 69% of Democrats, think he's too old to be effective for 4 more years. Biden's age isn't just a Fox News trope. It's been the subject of dinner table conversation across America this summer. It goes on, but basically that is the argument, the age, the infirmity. But look, I went on digging around, Jack, and just had a look at a bit of relative polling. And I know things are very, very different in the United States than they might have been 10 years ago. But Biden's polling numbers are very similar to Obama's in 2012, or indeed 2011, in the year before the 2012 presidential election. Obama's approval is at 40% in July 2011. That's through a Gallup poll. And Rasmussen on the weekend shows Biden at 46.53. So he's in slightly better shape.
Except that I don't think Obama was never behind in the battleground states the way that Biden is.
Look, there's some other polling that I wanted to have a look at too, Jack, and this is sort of head to head against Biden v the primaries list, or most of them. Biden v Trump, Trump +2. This is a Fox News poll, and it is a highly regarded poll. Trump +2. In that imaginary battleground, Biden leads against the lamentable RDS, Ron DeSantis, by 3 points. Nikki Haley leads by 2 against Biden. Ramaswamy is Ramaswamy +1. Christie is Biden +1, and Pence is Pence +1. With Tim Scott as Biden +1.
If Ramaswamy's a point in front of you, you're in trouble.
I would say that. I don't know. Everyone's just trying to kick him to death at the moment, which is probably the right thing to do. In a political fashion, metaphorical fashion, I should say. I've seen that on the left and the right. But these figures show that Trump is in as good a shape as anybody. I mean, no better than anybody, with the exception of Ron DeSantis.
Except that the indictments have made it almost certain that Trump will be the nominee, and because they have solidified support behind him, I think the Democrats are gearing up to push Joe out.
Yeah, okay. It's a good call. I mean, if we want to get into the speculative business, who's there? The VP.
That's the problem. It won't be Kamala because they don't see her, and they're quite right.
Newsom?
It's probably going to be Newsom, yes.
And that means that's the high-risk roll of the dice there of putting in a California progressive.
Yeah, it is. But I think they're looking at it and saying, we thought that if we could make sure that Trump was the GOP nominee, Joe would beat him. That doesn't look possible.
Newsom is very clever on his feet, I must say. I've seen a few interviews with him, including one on Fox News.
And Joe's not.
He was just better prepared than the interviewer. Yeah. And so he just – and when he doesn't know, like Trump and like Biden from time to time, he'll throw in some evidence or a statistic that if you go and check, it's not quite right, but he'll still go hard on it and to the point where the interviewer generally gives up. He's a pretty smart operator.
I don't think
whether he's going to get that, whether he's going to get support in Midwest states that have very different values to what California progressives have. That's the big question about Newsom.
I think they're looking at it and saying Joe won't survive an election campaign. There's no way he survives debates with Trump, and there's no way he can out-campaign Trump because Trump. One thing Trump's good at, he's a carnival huckster. He's a good campaigner.
There's a few things that happen when we are now getting in the speculative sort of area, and that's fine because there's a lot of things that can happen. I mean, Joe Biden could seriously fall off the twig. And of course,
or he could do a Mitch McConnell and just completely freeze during a press conference.
oh, that wasn't nice. It was a bit sad to watch, really, wasn't it? But also,
and if he does that, that's game over.
So, but also we've got to look at what's going to happen to Trump, Jack. And I just wanted to tell our listeners the timing of Trump's trials. Let's start firstly with the Fulton County RICO. No date for a trial has yet been set on that, although Kenneth Cheeseborough and Sidney Powell will be tried together on October 23. That's all we know about that.
The prosecutor wanted everyone to be tried together and the court said no.
Cheeseborough's an interesting case, Jack. Just as an aside, he's a highly regarded legal academic in Georgia, and obviously was providing advice to the Trump campaign and presidential group in 2020. He would be, I would imagine, quite alarmed to be indicted, and also now that he's got to be indicted or tried alongside Sidney Powell, that cannot please him. That's a place where you never want to be. That's on the bottom of the pack with four blokes on top of you. But look, that's that. That's just move on from the Georgia stuff. The DC 4-count indictment, that's going to trial on March the 4th. As far as we can tell at this day. That's the day before Super Tuesday primaries in Alabama. That's primaries for both Democrats and GOP. Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. So that's the day before the trial starts. The New York indictments. That trial starts on March 25, and while that would seem to be the lesser, potentially less destructive to Trump than the other three, it still runs straight through that very heavy primary process. And then you've got the secret docs indictment, which, according to the legal experts I read, would seem to be Trump's biggest fear. That trial begins on May 20 because there's a fairly strong evidentiary sort of link that includes Trump allegedly turning off CCTV footage, etc., so documents could be smuggled out. There's fairly strong a sort of evidentiary link there. So that's May 20, and all of that, of course, it occurs before the RNC convention. So, Jack, let me put it to you, having said all of that, how can you run a campaign from jail? How can you run a political campaign from jail?
Those all of these trials will guarantee him, I think, the nomination.
Yeah, but if he's convicted of one, we don't know about the Atlanta stuff. The Fulton County, Georgia RICO charges. That comes with found guilty, you're going to jail for 5 years minimum. How could you run potentially a political campaign from jail? And my answer is, I don't think you can.
I think he probably can. Why? Because I think at least all bar that perhaps the Florida charges, the document charges, people at least understand those. But the rest of them, I think a great many Americans will see as political prosecutions rather than criminal prosecutions.
Yeah, well, look, there's also the potential negative impact of all of the evidence being rolled out in trials, particularly the DC 4-count indictment, and then the secret doc stuff. That's not going to look too good for him. But my view is if he does do a bit of bird, I don't know that the GOP could actually run with him and would be looking for a replacement. That's my view. I mean, that's just a speculator, but I cannot see how he could run a campaign from jail.
I think this will make his campaign stronger. But we're going to have a different view about this. But
it's just one of many options that can occur.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the Americans are going to elect a bloke who's in the slammer. I think where you and I do agree is that the GOP and the Democrats can do a lot better than Donald Trump, not Eric Trump. They can do a whole lot better than Eric as well, and the Dems can do a lot better than Joe Biden.
Most Americans would rather see neither of them as president.
Exactly right. Yes. There is an impeachment process around Biden now, around President Biden, in relation to Hunter Biden's stuff, Jack, and the CNN fact check looked at these and found them to be a bit wanting. I mean, it is a bit funny, isn't it, that we actually have to have an investigation into impeachment?
No, because impeachments are not legal; they're political.
Yeah, well, there you go. Thank you for that answer. That is a perfect summary, yeah.
They have always been political. They have some of the trappings of a legal proceeding. But if you go back to the Clinton impeachment, I don't think you could fill a lift with senators who thought that he hadn't perjured himself.
Americans. You've probably got about 280 million Americans saying, oh, yeah, no, he definitely lied.
He definitely perjured himself, but they were never going to vote to impeach him because it's a political process, not a legal one. The interesting thing about the CNN fact check was that they found that all the facts bar one were true, but there were extenuating circumstances. And the fact that they said they were all true is another indication that, in my view, that the progressive end of the Democrats are moving against Joe. Jake Tapper was on CNN a couple of days later and running through a long list of all of the personal fabrications that Joe Biden goes up with, the Amtrak story, et cetera, the whole long list of them. Had a big screen up there and the whole thing. And this is CNN, and CNN are turning against Joe.
Well, I'll just go through this. There's a claim that the Biden family and associates got $20 million through shell companies, and CNN says this is true about Joe Biden's family and associates, but there is no public evidence to date that the president personally received any money. Claim. An informant alleged the Biden family got a bribe. And they say the facts first. It's true that an informant gave a tip of this nature to the FBI in 2020 and that the Bureau had viewed him as a credible informant, but the underlying allegation that the Biden family was given a bribe is totally unproven. The informant was merely reporting something he said he had been told by a Ukrainian businessman. Claim Biden participated in calls and dinners with Son's business partners. That's Hunter, of course. The facts first from CNN. McCarthy's claim omits key context about what was and wasn't reportedly discussed in the calls and dinners. A Hunter Biden associate testified that even though Joe Biden was on these calls and at these dinners, he didn't discuss business. And the Republicans have not presented any evidence that Joe Biden himself benefited financially from his appearance at the dinners or on the calls. There's one more here. Claim Biden family members' financial transactions were flagged as suspicious. CNN says the existence of these suspicious activity reports don't prove wrongdoing on their own. And I'll just go to one more, Jack. Then VP Biden used his powers to help his son's business. And the facts say there is no public evidence that Joe Biden abused his government powers to help his family. There are some.
You missed one. You missed the one about Joe not telling the truth about his
lied about his knowledge of family businesses.
Yeah, and this is a masterpiece from the CNN fact checkers. It's right up there with the Queen's recollections may vary, I think. Joe Biden's unequivocal denials of any business-related contract with his son have been undercut over time.
But so far, there is no public evidence that his occasional interactions with Hunter Biden's business partners led to him getting substantially involved in his son's financial.
That's CNN throwing him under the bus.
That whole part's a bit of soft nonsense, isn't it? Yeah. But that is essentially the grounds for impeachment. There's a very
It's the grounds
strong...
for the inquiry. It's the grounds for the inquiry.
Grounds for the inquiry, which may lead to impeachment, which is deeply, deeply political. I'd just simply say that the attempt to impeach Clinton actually drove his numbers up.
Yes.
And to a point where he was comfortably comfortably. I mean, it was during his second term, from memory, and so his numbers were never stronger than during that impeachment process, because people just, I mean, if you think there's distrust for president and for the office of the president, and indeed any presidential candidate that comes along, including Donald Trump, you should see what the American public thinks of the Congress.
Yes. And I think the same things, the same electoral results going to happen with the 4 lots of indictments as well. They're going to drive up Trump's numbers. I might be wrong about it, but that's just how I see it.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so special counsel, US special counsel investigating Donald Trump, and basically the signatory to the 4-count indictment in DC, which we mentioned before, Special Counsel Jack Smith, is asking a judge to impose limits on statements from former President Donald Trump regarding his court case over his attempt to overturn his 2020 election defeat. You have to say it's not really an Australian context, is it? Because if you're charged, if you're charged with an offence, you're very rarely going to talk about it, are you?
Yeah, but once again, this just looks like they're trying to hamstring Trump's election campaign.
It might look like that, but it's very odd that
whether it's true or not, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, and talking, I mean, basically running off the mouth at judges and Jack Smith himself and the DOJ and the weaponised FBI and all this sort of stuff. And maybe Trump needs to be quiet, Jack, because he had a bit of a shocker with an interview on NBC with Meet the Press host Kristen Welker. That included a couple of vignettes here that Joe, that is Biden, will get us into the next. Well, will get us in, not the next. Will get us into World War II, and I'm pretty sure that was over. And he proudly boasted leading Obama in the polls.
Yes. It was more of a Biden-esque performance with fumbling around. Anyway.
There were similar remarks made. It's certainly not by Trump fans, but suggesting that he was suffering a fair amount of mental disintegration himself, Jack.
As well. One of the interesting things that's happened over the last week or so with Trump is that he's making some noises about what happens with abortion post Roe v. Wade.
I did know he had an attack. He had an attack on RDS's Florida policies.
And Trump, don't forget, is really a kind of a liberal New Yorker by background.
Yeah.
And he thinks that they're going to have to come to some kind of accommodation across the country, and he's not putting a date on it, but he's sort of muttering about 15 or 20 week limits on abortion. And of course, that's driving the never Trumpers on the right nuts because they think that disqualifies him from support from the pro-lifers. But the pro-lifers seem pretty relaxed about it. This has been my tip, was where it'll end up all the way along, post Roe v. Wade, is that America will fall into line with the rest of the Western world.
Mate. It's just taking way too long. And in the meantime, you've got some of these very conservative states writing up laws, or had laws in place in many cases, that are really just not what you'd expect in the 21st century. But look, we've got to talk a little bit about Bidenomics, and what an absolute thrill it is, Jack. Because inflation in the United States is down. I mean, really down. I mean, the Reserve Bank of Australia would kill for those kinds of stats, but there are still huge cost of living pressures in the United States. While inflation is down in major spending areas like food, energy, used cars, these sorts of things, it's still very, very high.
It is. And for all that you might think that the Bidenomics, that Joe Biden's economics policy have been successful. The American people don't seem to agree with.
Well, that's the thing. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is that really when we talk about speculators, whether Trump's going to be in the slammer, whether Joe Biden's going to fall off the branch, all this sort of stuff, in the end, presidential elections will come down to economics and cost of living measures. So those things, those are the things that are killing him at the moment, and it seems difficult to see how that will change in any substantial way between now and November next year.
Yeah, most Americans think the economy's getting worse, not better.
All right. Look, we're going to shift across, and we did sort of talk to our listeners last week and say we hadn't done much of an update on Ukraine and Russia. There hasn't been a whole lot to report, but there was a bit of a breakthrough on the weekend when a number of villages in eastern Ukraine near Bakhmut were taken by Ukrainian forces. And I went looking for some sort of analysis, and I found the Institute for the Study of War, which is a group that's been around since 2007. And were first established because they thought there was a lot of malarkey being put around in the media about, essentially about US counterinsurgency in Iraq. That's how it all started. So there are a lot of military figures in the Institute for the Study of War. Their key takeaway on the Ukrainian operations in Bakhmut says that they have kept Russian reserves away from the south. Ukrainian, I'll just quote from the key takeaway in this report. Ukrainian forces are celebrating the liberation of two small towns south of Bakhmut, but Ukraine's entire effort first to defend and now to conduct counter-offensive operations around Bakhmut has been the subject of much unwarranted criticism. Ukraine's defensive and counter-offensive operations in the Bakhmut area since summer 2022, that's the northern summer, of course, are an operationally sound undertaking that has fixed a large amount of Russian combat power that would otherwise have been available to Russian defences in southern Ukraine, Jack. That's pretty good analysis, I think, and it has been one of those things that seems to have been a source of frustration for a lot of Ukraine supporters, a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the United States, saying that the counteroffensive wasn't working. And, of course, in the meantime, we've had basically the collapse of the Wagner Group, which were sort of tenacious defenders of Bakhmut, but they've all sort of been merged into the Russian military, Jack. So we're looking at incremental gains, but solid strategic gains, I think, is what this particular analysis points to.
Yeah, it's a very limited success, though, isn't it? They haven't actually really driven the Russians out anywhere.
Yeah, look, when we look at the calendar, we are 2 or 3 months away from a Ukrainian winter. So we
are weeks away from the rainfall and the start of the bog.
Yeah, and you would say so far that there haven't been major gains made. But what this report is saying is that basically that southern flank of where Russia's invasion impacted, that, and also includes the annexation of Crimea, has now sort of been exposed a bit. We'll see how we go. There have been, the New York Times is actually reporting a missile strike from the Ukrainians into a eastern Ukraine village, Jack, that killed a number of people, a misfire. And of course the Russians continue to bomb and send missiles to the Ukrainian civilian population. And of course Putin declared this week that there could be no prospect of peace while the Ukrainian counteroffensive continued. We will keep you updated, listeners. One story that has got me particularly interested. Oh, well, now look, before we leave that, we do have signatures from across the board in a letter to President Biden. it includes a signature from Lindsey Graham, South Carolina Senator. We've got Tom Cotton there, Republican, Susan M. Collins, and Roger F. Wicker, I should say. And they are calling for Army tactical missile systems to be sent to Ukraine. Currently, the Ukrainians are getting access to missile launching systems that are limited to 90 kilometres in range and cannot be fired into Russian territory. And now we've got support from the senators saying, let's get them into that 140 kilometre range and provide them with what are known in the military love acronyms, ATCAMS. No, that's not even the right, ATA, SCMS. Give them a further additional missile range. Good idea, Jack?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, they haven't done too badly, the Ukrainians. They just haven't done that well either.
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people didn't think this was going to go more than 2 weeks, and certainly the Russians didn't. They thought they would get their territorial gains and go as far as they could to Kyiv.
Oh no, I mean in the counteroffensive.
I understand. I understand what you're saying, but basically, what the world thought of in February 2022 was this will be over in weeks and poor Ukraine, and it really has exposed Russia's military and the entire infrastructure behind it as not quite being at superpower level, Jack.
Yeah, it certainly has done that.
All right, now we've got some interesting news from Canada, don't we, Jack? You're one of your favourite politicians, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but this is a very serious matter. So he hasn't donned the Indian kit to make this announcement, but Trudeau's government has accused India's government of involvement in the killing of a Canadian Sikh leader near Vancouver last June. He was shot to death. Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot to death in Vancouver, or south of Vancouver, in Surrey, I think it is, just south of Vancouver in British Columbia. As a result, the Trudeau government has expelled an Indian diplomat who appears to be working for India's intelligence agency over the shooting. Just to give people a background, on a mid-June evening in the busy parking lot of the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara temple in the city of Surrey, just south of Vancouver, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot dead in his truck by 2 masked gunmen. And months later, the unsolved killing continues to reverberate in Canada and across the board. Huge Sikh population, particularly in British Columbia, the biggest diaspora of Sikhs in the world, Jack. Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
Know that. Yeah, it's huge numbers. And hundreds of Sikh separatists took to the streets in Toronto, along with a handful of others in cities like London and Melbourne and San Francisco in early July to protest the Indian government's suspected involvement in the murder. And the Canadians have acted today, Jack.
They have. This has been a running sore between the Canadians and the Indians for some time, which is why it made the Trudeau visit to India even more bizarre than it appeared on its surface. There is a huge Indian diaspora in Canada, and particularly amongst the Sikhs, and that's a problem for India. It's because the Canadian government's been prepared to cozy up to Sikh separatists in Canada for political reasons, and the Indian government, with some justification, thinks that some of those separatists are in fact funding and organising terrorist attacks within India.
Well, yeah, there's one way of looking at it, Jack, but then there's another one, and this is an extrajudicial killing that the Canadian government actually believe is state-sponsored. So there's not a lot of difference in the behaviour of the Indian government, if that's the case, to to the murder of the WAPO journalist by the Saudis.
Yes.
So pretty messy there.
Absolutely, I agree. But we have to deal with the world as it is, and that's how politics in India is played.
Yeah. Yes. So look, this one thing that we can safely predict is this will take Canadian-Indian relations into a new low. They weren't very solid in the first place because of the sort of circumstances you were talking about there. The large number of Sikh separatists living, particularly in British Columbia. But this now takes it into a new low.
Yeah, it does.
So we won't. I think the other thing we can safely say is we won't see Justin Trudeau in the Indian kit getting off the plane at New Delhi anytime soon.
No, that's a good thing, but this is a big price to pay for it.
Okay. Well, you come and look. Putin was running around necking blokes in London for a very long time before the English did anything about it. And it's not the sign of a happy, healthy nation when those nations who do engage in extrajudicial killings on another country's turf. And we'll keep an eye on that story because that is going to bubble away for a long time. Now, Jack, sport, our very favourite part of the segment. And very sad news over the weekend with the death of the great titan of Australian rules football, Ronald Dale Barassi. Where do we start with him? Long-time player, I think 5 premierships at Melbourne. 6 was it? Yeah, that's okay. Yes, I stand corrected. 2 at Carlton as coach. He, I think, wasn't playing in '68, or maybe he was a playing coach at that time.
The committee retired. The match committee retired him with about four rounds to go. They said, Ron.
Yeah. He played an even 50 games at the Blues, and then coached them to the 68 and 19, perhaps the most famous of all, Jack, the 1970 grand final. Then went on to coach North Melbourne in a club that had been stagnating at the bottom for a very, very long time. Had a new administration with a bit of vision, and they took Barassi on 2 premierships at North Melbourne. Then coached Melbourne when they were in a deep funk. Perhaps didn't have the great success there in terms of premierships. But a couple of years after his retirement or resignation there, they made a grand final. And then, of course, he came up to coach in his dotage as a coach. He came up to coach the Sydney Swans Footy Club, and everyone at that club just regards him so highly for the work that he did there.
I was quite staggered the first time I went to a president's pre-match dinner at the Sydney Swans, and I knew Ron had gone up there and coached them. But when he walked in, it was like the second coming. They absolutely adored him, and the history of that is just like North Melbourne. He came to a club that was really struggling to survive. It was almost gone, and he gave them something to believe in and something to take them forward and save them. Really,
his last game as coach, I remember being there. Sydney beat Collingwood in a home and away game. They finished sort of probably 13th or 14th on the ladder, the Sydney Swans, but they come up with a very good win that day with an emerging Paul Kelly, not the journalist, not the singer, but the Brownlow medalist and captain of the Sydney Swans, played an absolute blinder. And then, of course, Barras stayed on as chairman. Now, I know a number of journalists. I've met Barras a number of times. He was a good fellow. A number of journalists. One mate of mine at the Australian used to ghost him, and got on. Everyone got on really well with him. I mean, everyone that I know who had anything to do with Barassi had nothing but the hugest amount of respect for the man.
He was excellent company, and
used to drink a little rum and cola, Jack, in a tiny little glass, probably a 4-ounce glass. And he'd drink away at those. look, he had this extraordinary partnership with his second wife, and they've been married many, many years. Cheryl, who was an artist. I mean, they were completely, different people in many respects. But Cheryl issued a statement. Cheryl Barassi issued a statement. She said, "To all people who clearly feel for him, I would like you to know that Ron was as good as you think and even more." So that's a rather lovely thing for his wife to say of him, and I think that's pretty much sums up how everyone feels about Ronald Dale Barassi, one of the greats of Australian sport.
Yeah, well, there never has been before, and I think there never will be again, a football figure who's so loved at 4 different AFL clubs.
Died a year exactly to the day after Alan Aylett passed away, Jack.
Yeah, and if you're on Facebook, have a look. There's someone's dug out a lovely piece that Brent Croswell wrote in his brief period as an Age journalist.
Wonderful writer.
About playing chess against Barras.
Yeah.
It's a beauty. It's a ripper.
Tiger was a better chess player too, I think. And Barras didn't like it much. All right, so when we get into Vale, the great Ronald Dale, but when we get into the finals, of course, the Blues had a come from behind win against Melbourne. The noise, they say, shook the stadium, Jack. Must have been a good 60,000 Blues fans there. There would have been a few Melbourne ones going, "Oh no," but the yes that came with the siren blast, MCC officials said they'd never seen anything quite like it. Well, no matter what you say about the Blues supporters, mate, they do make a big noise.
Yep.
And they, of course, they go on to play Brisbane at the Gabba. And the Giants, are probably with Carlton, probably the best form team in the comp at the moment, go on to play Collingwood at the MCG, and they don't seem terribly fazed by the continue to play away sort of stuff. They don't worry about that at all, the Giants. They've been an extraordinary story this week. Or this season, like Carlton. I think Carlton were 15th and the Giants 14th about 3 months ago.
Not even that. More recently than that. They're both playing tremendously good footy. I think if you were in AFL head office, you'd be barracking for a Collingwood-Carlton grand final.
Well, yeah. Melbourne would explode. I mean, it hasn't happened since 1981 in the old VFL competition. So, both, the Pies have got 100,000 plus members. Carlton have got 80-odd thousand. Very loud people, of course. So that would be
all good, respectable,
very fine people.
Yeah,
none finer. But of course, the nightmare scenario, Jack, would be that the Lions beat Carlton, which is very likely, by the way. I mean, the Lions look set to me, not just to win on Saturday night, but to win the flag. They looked settled for me for a long time. When we talk about best form sides in the competition, you can't exclude the Lions. So it could be a Lions v Giants grand final, Jack.
What, you reckon the bouncers would be outside throwing them in rather than inside throwing them out?
Yeah, exactly. Could end up like that. And while we're on the subject, the NRL is facing a very similar sort of scenario. Melbourne Storm, who fell across the line against the Roosters on the weekend, and the New Zealand Warriors, the Warriors look primed. They look good. So Melbourne will play the Panthers this weekend, and the Wars, as they're known in New Zealand, will play the Broncos in Brisbane. So the nightmare scenario for the NRL would be a Melbourne Wars grand final. Don't think it's likely, a bit like the AFL, don't think it's likely. The Panthers have had it all over Melbourne for a couple of years now. And the Wars will be playing the Broncos, who are in very, very good nick. But they are a bit like Carlton, or indeed the Giants. The Warriors are a real success story, come from nothing sort of story. And apparently it has gripped the New Zealanders more so, according to the bloke I was listening to on Triple M on the weekend, more so than the All Blacks. Do you believe it, Jack?
Well, the way the All Blacks are going at the moment, I can understand it.
I think that's where we go. Look, just to follow up on the Maynard issue and the concussion that affected Angus Brayshaw, Melbourne midfielder. Maynard got off, of course, and there was a lot of discussion about whether that should be the case. A lot of criticism about no penalty for causing Angus Brayshaw, who has a history of concussion, further concussion injury. And then out of that comes Jack. Lethal Lee Matthews has stepped up and made a couple of suggestions for making the game a bit safer, Jack.
Yeah,
you can tell it's not 1972.
There'd be a lot of former players who would be reading that over their cornflakes in the morning and saying, "What? Lee's concerned about head safety now?"
Lethal Lee.
I can still feel it, you know.
Yeah, he would have. He knocked a few blokes senseless along the way. Jack, I mean, there are some that are pretty good. There's a little clip of him playing against Carlton where he belts about 4 blokes in the space of 10 seconds. And it's all very subtle, and the one or even 2 umpires that would have been there in those days, no one saw anything. But anyway, look, the suggestions are, and they're worth a bit of merit, get rid of interchange. What? Slow the game down a bit, and would Braden Maynard have gone that hard if he knew he had to play 120 minutes? Get rid of the interchange, Jack. You'll see blokes crawling in the last quarter. Don't know about that one. I think, if anything, you're going to broaden the interchange numbers, and of course they have been for some time. And we do have, a concussion sub that's now become a sort of tactical sub, don't we, in the game? I think, in terms of the concussion type issues, the biggest problem, or the code with the biggest problem, is the NRL, Jack, because it is a sport built on impact and collision.
Yeah.
So how do you go? Well, what do you do?
I don't know. I've got some sympathy for not getting rid of the interchange, but limiting it much more.
Well, just talking about NRL for a moment. If we look at sort of concussion injuries, and more the neurologists are saying you've got to be spelled for 3 or 4 weeks. Minimum, not 1 or 2, which is the AFL and NRL sort of concussion protocols. It's got to be 3 or 4 minimum. We talk about helmets, and they're not quite effective because it's not really the head blow. It's the sort of impact injuries that throw the head back that are causing the problem. So that's very difficult to prevent. By use of helmets and so forth. I mean, going forward, sports like AFL and NRL in particular have got real problems in terms of how they're going to deal with this.
Yeah, they do. It's easier to get the head injuries out of
cricket, let's say,
out of AFL and out of rugby union than it is out of rugby league.
Yeah, rugby league's the sport that's got the biggest problem, I think. Yeah, definitely. Best wishes to those 4 teams in the NRL and those 4 teams in the AFL for this weekend. And we'll know who plays in their respective grand finals come Saturday night. Now, the Rugby World Cup has been played, Jack, and Australia took a loss to Fiji, meaning they now have to beat Wales to get out of the group area. Fiji are playing not that sort of expansive, fun-loving sort of footy that they have been known for. They're showing really strong defence now, a bit of tactical nous. They've been playing very well, haven't they? That's the first.
Yeah, they're in hot form. They beat England at Twickenham in a warm-up game. But a serious warm-up game. They should have beaten Wales. They were a bit unlucky with the ref, and in the last play of the game, their winger had about 5 or 6 metres of line open, and he knocked on. So they should have beaten Wales, and they've comfortably beaten Australia. Wales, that's a toss-up. We're no good things to beat them.
Oh, no, you wouldn't think so. There'd be fairly long odds, I would think. What about the coach, Jack? What about our coach? Jonesy's been coach there for a while. He's an amusing, if somewhat odd figure in a post-match presser, isn't he?
He is. Eccentric
comments.
doesn't begin to describe it. I think the Australian Rugby Union's problems go deeper than the appointment of the coach. They need a root and branch reform in there.
Well, I think when it comes to Jones, and if they do get bundled out in the group stage, which is quite likely, he'll turn around and say, "Well, we didn't expect to win this anyway." That's the sort of thing Jones will do. He'll immediately say that. But the future of the game stuff. Are we now seeing that great mistake that rugby union made 20 plus years ago when it took what was then the Super 12 into the echelons of pay-per-view TV and excluded, basically stopped growing their market? The start of the mistake was the post the 2003 World Cup. They were drowning in money. They made a hell of a lot of money out of that, and they've wasted all of it since then. All right. Now, Spring Carnival, Jack, and you told us you were going to be watching it. I did see Mr. Brightside had a very good win in the Maccabi Divas Stakes, very short odds.
Two that I noticed this week that are worth keeping an eye on. Two imports, both actually imported by one by an Irishman I know and one by a Frenchman I know who are bloodstock agents, good fellas too. One's called Carini, the other one's called Just Fine, and they are looking for even more ground and are two to keep an eye on, as is Amelia's Jewel.
Huey
Bowman, the racing season started here last week, and Huey Bowman, the jockey, has moved up here full time for the season.
And there's a Hong Kong connection, Jack, Romantic Warrior.
Yep, our best 2,000 metre horse is already. I think he's favourite for the Cox Plate. Yeah.
Okay. All right. There's a couple of little leads there for you. Wouldn't call them tips. I'd just say have a look.
Keep an eye on them.
Check prices. Yep. Keep an eye on it, Jack. Now take us out as we wrap up for the day.
We were talking before about Kamala Harris and how she's going, and Nancy Pelosi was giving an interview with, I think, Anderson Cooper, and to be fair, her support for Kamala Harris was a little lukewarm. What did she say? She's the Vice President of the United States. So when people say to me, well, why isn't she doing this or that? I said, because she's the Vice President. That's the job description. You don't do much of that, So this is Nancy. And as soon as this interview was over, someone's popped this up on social media. Nancy's going to have a chat with Harris. It'll go something like this. Hello, Cam. Great shoes. Listen, Joe's out. We like you. We respect you. But no White House, not this term. Trump will ruin you. And we need you. Come back to California. We'll set you up in a high-awareness, low-income non-profit. We're going to back Gav for the president, and once he's gone, the governorship is yours. Put in some years. After Gav, we'll put you up for the White House, if you can wait. If you can't wait, we'll give you Diane's seat. Manolos? Those shoes Manolos?
Well, that's very, very sexist of you, Jack. So the two women in politics would just chat about their shoes. If she was, if Kamala was actually governor of California, then one would expect a return to fairly high execution rates, Jack.
Yes, she was a very the only job she's worked hard at. The only job she's worked hard at in her life was being a prosecutor.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. And look, the take-home message for all of our listeners today is that Jack has smelt around the body of Joe Biden and decided that he is gone, and that the Dems will replace him. And
that's not quite true. What I think is there is a queue of Democrats lining up to push him off the cliff.
Oh, same thing, Jack. Same bloody thing. You reckon he's gone? You've tipped it. And have the bloody courage to back it up. So do you reckon he's gone? Now, look,
They've got to get him out. I think they want to get him out. Whether they can get the crowbar in there and shoehorn him out.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. But it's a big tip, and we'll keep an eye on it. And thank you, listeners, for bearing with us today and listening to our opinions and analysis of all things important around the world. And we just want to remind you to drop us a line if you've got any comments, criticisms, suggestions, whatever. You can drop me a line. You can hit us up on email, the Conditional Release Program, the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com, I should say, or you can hit me up on my Twitter account. DM's always open, at Jack the Insider, and you can hit up Jack too, Hong Kong Jack that is, and give it to me, Jack.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
Excellent work. All right. Thank you, listeners, and we'll speak to you next week.